Good morning, and thank you for tuning in to the Conflict Consortium virtual workshop. We have Whitney Taylor from Cornell doing some talking with us about some of her co-authored work on sanctions and genocide, and Risa Brooks is going to get us started with comments.
Great. So since I'm starting off, I thought I would start out with a big picture kind of question to throw at you and see what your reactions are. So essentially, as everyone knows, the paper is about the effect of sanctions, comprehensive sanctions on genocide magnitude and duration. And when I, picked up the paper, I was, really interested and thought, okay, I haven't really seen anything on this issue area. We'll see what they find. And, sort of what is the argument? What is going to be the argument about why we should think about sanctions and genocide different and apart from what's already been done? And so that's sort of the spirit of the first question I'm going to raise, which is, we have a lot of literature on when sanctions, these kinds of sanctions, comprehensive sanctions, do and don't work, and we could quibble about that and argue about that literature, and a lot of people have done that. But why isn't that sufficient? What is distinctive about genocide as an issue area that we should expect that we find something different in relation to how sanctions affect it? And that's sort of the theoretical or analytical intuition that I didn't see very much in this paper. As I see it, genocide could be is a really distinctive phenomenon, and we need to understand more about that. And then, I would like to know and hear more from you about, what it is about sanctions that matters in this issue area. Why should we get a different outcome from what we already know about how sanctions affect other issue areas? So I'm just going to start with that question. I have a bunch of other things to say, but I'll just put that out there. And since I'm sort of new to the virtual seminar, see how this goes.
Okay, so should I just start responding to
Sure,
that?
great. Yeah, Whitney.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that's this is definitely a fair critique that we don't clarify the initial impulse for the study. And I think the way we've been talking about it is that whenever there's sort of an episode of mass violence, you do hear in the media, or at least from NGOs, a discussion of the possibility of sanctions. And it seems like a policy tool that policymakers consider. And so for that reason, it's worth investigating whether or not we do find the same relationship with respect to genocide that we see with other issue areas when sanctions are involved. Yeah, I mean, I guess we should clarify more. Every now and then in the literature review, we talk about how we expect genocide might be a little bit different. For instance, we wouldn't really expect like an indirect pathway where sanctions sort of inspire people in the target state to rise up against the government. But it's definitely fair that we should pull out more of the insights about that relationship.
Should I talk? Or
messing with my yeah. Risa, do you want to respond? And Matt, that's a one finger, right?
One finger is a new point. Two fingers is a point to connect.
Right.
Okay.
And I'm just it is a two. Okay, sorry. So let me go to Matt on a two finger, and then follow up with Risa.
Sounds good.
Okay. So Whitney, just following up on that point. In the paper, you both spend a lot of time talking about the costs of sanctions, and I wonder where you could expand on the potential distinctiveness of sanctions and genocide, and maybe even a little more on the theoretical expectations regarding why sanctions might or might not work, in focusing a little more on the costs and whether the costs of sanctions outweigh the costs of the policy, right? Because genocide seems to be a policy that would have a different set of costs relative to some of the other human rights violations that a state might engage in. And so that might be a place to clarify that a little bit.
All right, okay, thanks.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and sort of the theoretical expectations, framing it that way is, I think, a good way to think about it. You know, what is unique about genocide, and what, given that, should, and the type of mechanism that sanctions are, this type of mechanism of imposing costs through trade and financial, et cetera, sanctions, you know, how does that compare, or how should that affect the incidence of genocide, the magnitude and duration, especially after it started, which is something that you make clear is your, you know, empirical focus. And so I think it's right. It seems unlikely that it is going to have much effect on magnitude and duration, or maybe you think it could or should. You know, I just want to know, I think, you know, my instinct was to want to know more about what you think you should find, so have a more theoretical motivation for the argument and for the paper.
Okay, Whitney, any response there, or?
No, I think this is completely fair. As we were working on this paper, I think it was easy to get lost in just how much literature there is on economic sanctions in full, and so pulling out like what we can best build on is something that we struggled with. But this time, I think, clarifies things.
I wonder if we could ask you to just briefly tell us where did the paper come from? What got you to pursue this project?
Yeah, so my co-author Hollie, her dissertation research was on genocide, and she's furthered that as an assistant professor. And I have been interested in genocide and human rights violations in general, although that's not the main focus of my research. And so it kind of came out of, we had read some of Matt's work, actually, and we were talking about it, and then it just sort of, I don't know, grew from that.
Okay, cool. And the queue is open. If someone has popped up a 1 or a 2 finger, I missed it. And so we've got a two from Matt. But at any time, just put up 1 or 2, and if I'm not paying enough attention, you can ping me on the side with there's a little chat box you can open up. And Halvard got you. Matt?
Okay. Just to build off the what we were talking about before about costs, there's a few points in the paper where, as an aside, you and Hollie say there are other ways in which genocide or political mass killing can be countered through the international community, but that's potentially not related to sanctions. And I wonder if you've thought about connecting the argument you're making about sanctions to some of these other approaches, because there is this sanctions literature that talks about states that are sanctioned are more likely to have reductions in foreign direct investment, or are named and shamed, right? And there's that literature as well. And I know that might be pushing you into a slightly different area, but I wonder if, as you're building this argument about costs, whether or not that might not factor into it a little bit.
Yeah, I think it definitely could. If we're sort of conceptualizing cost broadly, part of the cost would be, straight economic, which we might see through sanctions or changes in FDI. There might also be associated sort of reputational costs that would be important to look at. That's not something we've done yet, so I can't give you a full answer, but we'll definitely think about it as we move forward.
Okay, Halvard, and the queue is open. So.
Yeah, I agree that it does make sense to look a little bit more into the cost issue, which I think is quite central here. One thing I did note was that virtually all of the events of genocide are within the shadow of civil wars, right? Mm-hmm. And in many of those cases, in many of those conflicts, you also have external actors involved. Many of these conflicts would be typically labeled so-called proxy wars, where there are not only costs, but clearly also benefits. And so I wonder whether you have discussed with your co-author the relative cost versus benefit of continuing the genocide, and more generally also sustaining conflict.
Yeah, I mean, we've discussed it only a little bit, insofar as I think sanctions might not be enough to alter a cost-benefit calculation of those involved in perpetrating genocide for a couple of reasons. For one, the political goal might be valued more highly than the cost of the sanction, or the cost of stopping the genocide once it's started might also be higher than the cost of the sanctions. But I don't think we've discussed it, at least not in detail, in relation to this broader sense that there are external actors involved. If these are, proxy wars, then we would expect there would be certain economic or military relations that aren't necessarily visible that would sort of alter the relative power there and the incentives placed on different actors. But that's something else we can look into more.
One thing you guys might think about in terms of the not visible relationships is alliance patterns.
Okay.
No, I mean that's a stretch, but it might or perhaps UN voting or other kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
Or actually even just a qualitative, right? I mean, if you can't, even just a qualitative binary, which is all you'd really get out of that anyway, would actually probably be better to try to get. Because that was something I was thinking about in terms of a case that I happen to know really well is the Rhodesian case, and the South African government was literally underwriting down to the level of, I think it got up as high as about 30% of the national budget during the last several years. South Africa was just, paying their national budget in an effort to help sustain the state, which played. And it was when South Africa stopped doing that they came to the table. So that's a potentially interesting direction. Jackie or Babak? Or Jackie?
Sure. Following up on this idea of sort of unobservable effects, and also adding to something that's in the paper now, which is about the possibility of selection. I'm wondering if there is a separate selection effect here as far as sanctions go, which is that an outside actor whose sanctions could be efficacious enough to really pressure the state to change its behavior may be exactly the state that doesn't actually have to impose sanctions, right? So maybe it is that the threat from those senders might be enough to change the genocidal government's preferences. And so, therefore, those sanctions that we see are those that are actually less likely to be impactful. Maybe they're from less influential senders or less interconnected senders than others. And one thing that I think is really interesting if you play that out is that if that story is correct, there are two things we'd expect to see empirically, right? One is that sanctions that are actually imposed should not matter, which is what you find. Because the states who do that are the ones who exert relatively little influence over the target. But the other thing we would expect to see is a threat of sanctions from highly influential states or from maybe some other statement of disapproval from the really influential states, and that those threats or those statements should affect the likelihood or the duration or the severity of genocide. So if you tease that argument out, it explains what you find, and it also suggests another probably testable hypothesis.
Right. So would you suggest then we have a threat variable in there, but we don't disaggregate threat based on sort of who is the one threatening, like what characteristics of that state, whether it's a powerful state or not. So would you just suggest sort of looking at coding like powerful states and then only having those threats in the...
Or even just sort of modeling that relationship. And so one way to do it that I was thinking about might be to look at whether the effect of sanctions or the effect of threats are conditioned by the economic relationship between sender and target. And then you could sort of tease out whether the states that are getting changes in behavior are the ones that are in a position to really hurt the genocidals.
Okay. I haven't missed anyone on a queue, have I? Matt, somehow I'm not. I get your face, but not the. I can't see if that's 2 or 1. Okay, it's 2, and Babak on a 2. Okay, I've got a 1, so let's go with Matt and then Babak.
All right. Real quick, as always, Jackie's right. But I think in particular, her point is really important. That is, first of all, I think it's less surprising that, as she said, it's less surprising that those sanctions that are imposed don't work, right? I mean, the literature seems to suggest that.
Mm-hmm.
But the literature seems to suggest also that threats should work, and if they don't, right, the way to really get at that would be, you'd expect that the U.S. probably has less influence over Sudan than China, right, in terms of being this conditional effect or mediating effect, I think is really important. And then you really have some value added beyond just the initial motivation of the paper, which is to explore this relationship. I think what that then allows you to do is really more deeply explain what's going on or not going on.
Right.
So I think that suggestion is exactly right.
Okay. Did you want to respond, Whitney, or we're good?
No, I think I'm on the same page as you guys, I think, on this.
Okay, great. And Matt, I'm loving the legacy blueberry iMac. Is that what I saw in the background there?
Oh yeah.
Okay, Babak.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Actually, my point is really related to Matt's point. I think you discussed about how this economic sanction is effective, and it's related to trade policy, regime type, this kind of stuff in the empirical section of your paper. So as a control variable. But I think you may want to give it more attention and bring it to your theoretical argument, because if trade policy has a significant is a very important conditional factor. If you don't have an open trade policy, so why you should care about economic sanction? And so if we consider this argument, then as Matt mentioned, if you find something interesting, and so for example, if you add an interaction term between economic sanction and trade policy, or economic sanction and regime type, and you find some positive effect, in that case, I think it would be more interesting for your readers, because you are finding an effective economic sanction in this sub policy. Briefly, I read that you said most of the countries in your cases are not democracy, but still you have a variation within that among these cases. Mm-hmm. So I think you may be able to find something if you use the interaction term and discuss this conditional effect.
Uh-huh.
Okay. I might take us in a little bit different. Well, it's still on theory, but a little bit different direction. I don't know whether you've seen, Whitney, the work by Clayton Tyne on is it rational expectations argument. There's an article in JCR and maybe ISQ. There's also a book, and I can send that. Look it up and send it. But the basic idea is he's actually interested in third-party interventions into civil wars and the impact of those interventions on both onset, duration, and term, or not both. There's three: onset, duration, and termination. And so it's not the same topic, but it's a similar process, similar actors, and what he argues is that that few states, or rebels for that matter, should be surprised by interventions. That is, that they're highly incentivized to think about whether or not they're going to be interventions by third parties, and to that extent that their behavior will be conditional on those expectations, and so. It seems to me that might be worth reading through and giving consideration to your own paper, because it sets up an argument that says we wouldn't expect much of an effect, which is something that you find. The idea being that most states that are thinking about committing genocides are going to take into consideration before doing so the possibility of being sanctioned as a cost. Once sanctions, become a tool in the international system, and during your period of study that holds, and so that might be worth taking a look at. I'm assuming you haven't given that thought. Is that
No,
correct?
I haven't.
Okay.
But thanks for that suggestion.
Okay. And of course I was talking, so I wasn't paying attention. Risa has a 2-finger. Did anybody else? Got Risa on the 2. Okay.
So I think this idea of thinking about the genocidal state as a strategic actor is really important. And I'll just give you an example, and this is just from my undergraduate teaching, so I'm not an expert on the Rwandan genocide, but it is always something that undergrads really focus on, is how much the regime was really thinking about how to head off any sort of robust international intervention in terms of how they structured the genocide and in terms of killing Belgian peacekeepers. So it's not just that they're sort of anticipating the possibility of intervention and discounting it and making the decision to engage in genocide, but that they're actually taking actions to assure that strategic outcome. So the sort of dynamism of that, I mean, that's really fascinating, and I don't know exactly how that fits into your argument as it stands, but I think it's sort of pushing toward sort of a, moving in this direction. And again, just my instincts is to, you have a nice empirical contribution so far, moving it to more of a theoretical contribution as well.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, we've discussed this a little bit and how to, because we don't want to, there are a couple of dangers here. We don't want to suggest that genocide is 100% irrational. We also don't want to say that it's rational in a way that then legitimates it. But then, so we've tried to navigate how to talk about the genocidal state as strategic actors, not knowing much about their motivations. But I think one way we could look at this, in the literature review and the theoretical setup, we can pull out more of the strategic language. And we've talked a little bit about doing some case studies where we might be able to investigate the dynamics in a way that we feel comfortable talking about what the strategic considerations are, without sort of, I don't know, making out all of these cases to be the exact same, because we don't think the dynamics are the exact same across all of these. But yeah, thank you for that suggestion. Yeah.
Okay. Babak on a 1-finger. And the queue is open.
Okay, I have a main question actually based on what I know from Iran case as a genocide case. Actually, in Iran case, you can see that states want to to finish this genocide project as soon as possible. So my question would be: sanctions usually have a legal process. You cannot either within country or outside international community. For example, for Iran nuclear program, the international community wanted to impose sanction. It took about 1 year, so all of these international community and actors decided to impose the sanction, pass the required bills. So you have some events, some factors that they are changing very fast. They are very short term. But on the other hand, you have economic sanction, which usually I think they take a while to be able for the actor to be able to pass them. So this is my point. So I don't know how this theoretical relation can be developed.
Yeah, I think that's something we should look into further, because if that process is typical, that it takes a long time, it's legalistic, it's highly visible, then we would expect state leaders to be aware that this is going on, and not just that it's a possibility, but they would have a decent amount of information that would allow them to, I think, relatively accurately assess when the sanctions will actually be imposed. And then that would affect the strategic logic, definitely. And it might also affect how the violence is occurring. If these actors can hide some of the violence or can do different things. So yeah, that's something we should definitely look into.
Okay, Halvard.
This resonates very much with one of the comments that I had written down. The issue of time, which I think it would be good if you discussed in a little bit more detail. I agree theoretically, but that should also presumably have some implications for your estimation strategy and your model specification. So I was wondering, to me, it would make sense to try to explore or to tease out a larger time span from the initiation of, or the threat of the sanction. But perhaps more interestingly, more importantly, also from the initiation of the actual or the implementation of that sanction until any change in observed behavior can be expected. So if I understand your estimation strategy correctly, you basically just do correlations on a single year, maybe with a time lag of 1 year, I don't know. But what about consecutive years or the duration of the sanction on the effect of genocide, for example? That would be interesting to know a little bit more about.
Yeah, so it is just the sort of instantaneous effect. We have one model specification where we have the duration of the sanction, like how old the sanction is. We include that as a variable, but yeah, one thing that I don't know how to do exactly is how to allow for the sort of full effect of the sanction. So if we think that it might take 2 years or 3 years or 4 years to see an effect, how could we better model that process? And so hopefully you have a suggestion on that.
Okay, Halvard and Jackie and then Matt all have a two-finger here.
Yeah, I wish I had a firm and firm suggestion for exactly how to model that and how to theorize that. Unfortunately, I don't know the literature well enough to really come up with specific suggestions, other than at least coming from this from the outside. I would like to look into this and just test alternative associations and see if there is any signal in the data. I have a two-finger, but maybe it isn't a two-finger, but it does relate to the specification of the models, but not necessarily to the time issue as such. So maybe I'll leave that for.
Yeah, why don't I come back to that and Jackie and Matt.
Yeah.
Sorry. On the question of how to model sort of a shock and then a return to a prior state, I don't know this model well, but there's something called a quantal response model. I think it's from econ, and the idea is that you have some stasis, and then you have an exogenous shock, and then you measure the effects of your covariates and how long it takes the system to return. So I don't know a lot about it, but it might be something that's worth looking into on that point. But my actual two fingers was on this issue of time, and while we're talking about things that you can investigate, you cite Murdy and Peterson, who argue that in the presence of widespread repression in Burma, HROs called for the imposition of sanctions, and the sanctions then affected or didn't affect killing. And that sort of suggests this longer, or this different process playing out over time, where the causal arrow might point in the other direction, or there might be some feedback, so that human rights affect sanctions, which then in turn might affect human rights. And I think that that's something that you might want to engage and look into as well, while you're sort of teasing out how this plays out over time. And it would also push you to connect to something Risa said at the beginning, to really think about the causal process.
Okay, great. Whitney, you're good?
Yep.
Okay, Matt?
Some of this may have been covered already. I just want to clarify. I was a little unclear when I was reading the paper as to whether you were looking at sanctions and magnitude of severity in the same year, and it sounds like you were. It sounds to me like theoretically you're arguing that sanctions this year should affect severity next year, and I mean that also helps methodologically in dealing with issues of temporal ordering and whatnot.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether you and your co-author have talked about that and why you landed on the approach that you did.
Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to think back. We've specified this a number of different ways over the couple of years that we've worked on this. And I think we landed on this because ultimately the year is 12 months. So we thought that might in fact be enough time, specifically because we didn't code sanctions that were in the last month of the year as having occurred in that year. But it would be worth looking into just lagging that and seeing if we might find an effect there, because it might need a little bit more time than we give it for sanction to see an effect of sanctions.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Halvard?
Yeah, moving on a little bit, but still dealing with issues of model specification. So your theory really is about a shock occurring, and then you should expect, or maybe not, a change in behavior, right? And so because of that, the dependent variable, it sounds to me, should be a change and not a level. Whereas the model as it is set up, you basically just regress the occurrence or not of a sanction on the level of genocide, or the severity of genocide. And I wonder whether most of the explained variance that you're picking up here is driven by differences between cases and not necessarily differences over time. And so I would probably recommend you looking into some ways to try to tease out the temporal effect specifically. That could maybe be done in a form of a fixed effects model, or you could operationalize your dependent variable a little bit differently, rather than keeping the original levels from the political stability task force. You could recode that to capture change, and then you could have alternative measures capturing different rates of change, or the extent of change. Probably that would give you the same outcome, the same conclusion, but I think it could be more appropriate to the theory that you're advancing here.
Okay. Yeah, I know in the past we have looked at sort of the if the DV is coded as a 1 if there's an increase, a 0 if it stays the same, or a -1 if there's a decrease in category. It gets a little bit tricky because the categories are not sort of equal in units. They're, but yeah, that's something we should consider again.
Risa?
Yeah, it's somewhat related to this theme of change versus level and dependent variable. I think, one thing that in the literature that's cited in there, where there's this discussion about how sanctions don't work, and there's a little bit of a debate about that, a lot of that literature, as I understand, is really sensitive to the definition of success and whether it works. And Pape is in particular really problematical in this regard, and in the sense that he thinks that sanctions should result in complete policy change. So in this case would be a complete stopping of genocide. And I think a much better way to think about it is, if we're thinking in terms of, resolving conflict, moving policy positions, opening up bargaining spaces, that sort of thing. And, when I was thinking about duration and magnitude, how does that relate to this notion of success? Like, what is that, should it just be stopping of genocide, or do you want to are you actually providing a more nuanced way of thinking about success, because you're saying it's not, completely ending it, but it's reducing it that matters, or, sort of what, how are you thinking about, the meaning of this outcome and what the implications of different ways of measuring it are? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's something that we've, I don't think Hollie and I have sort of settled on what we think success actually looks like. Because one thing that we've talked about is we could can imagine a scenario in which sanctions are associated with reduced magnitude of genocide, but the genocide actually goes on for a longer duration because there's some sort of learning here that the target state needs to change its behavior a little bit. It still values the political goal that's associated with genocide, but it wants to sort of get out of the international spotlight, or at least reduce the likelihood of continued sanctions or some other policy intervention. And so there, if we just conceptualize success as reduced magnitude, we would have a scenario in which it's probably not actually successful, even though the magnitude might have decreased, because more people might die in the long run. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't think we want to say that success is only ending genocide, because we could.
Yeah.
I think we value, I guess, like fewer lives lost, or fewer other acts of violence associated with genocide.
As we all should value.
Yes. But yeah, so I think that's something we could talk more about and clarify in the piece.
Okay. I have an issue, and it goes back to a discussion on page 3 that I suspect would have surprised me less if I was if I read more frequently in the sanctions literature, which I don't. But you talk about following suit. Well, most studies assume a direct causal pathway, as it were, right? So you make this distinction between an indirect and a direct causal pathway, and I want you to encourage you guys to consider whether or not that is at all necessary for you to distinguish and think about. Specifically, what if you assume it might take either pathway? How would that change your theory? How would that actually change any of your hypotheses? Would it? It wasn't obvious to me that it would. Or would it actually change your research design? And it struck me as odd, because I just don't. I often will go to just kind of a generic selectorate sort of thinking in these areas when I start thinking about trying to pressure states, and start thinking about, well, it seems to me the key problem is to isolate the regime's members of the regime's winning coalition. You want to try to shrink and affect using that kind of selectorate language. You want to shrink the regime's winning coalition's supporters by hurting them economically. And it seems to me that in a case of genocide, there's no one that's within that. Just by definition, the people who are being targeted are not going to be involved in the winning coalition, and so the protest model just doesn't seem relevant. But that doesn't mean it's usually the case that the people who are being targeted are also not particularly well placed economically. Not always, but generally that's the case. And so I don't know. To me, it opened up a whole bunch of questions that I don't think you wanted me as the reader to be asking. Okay. Because you don't theoretically go that way, you might, and I would encourage you, and I'll follow up with another comment later on how you might think more about that. But I wanted to. Am I missing? If you don't assume away the indirect link, would your hypotheses or research design change in any way?
Not really. I don't think. And I think we have the language where we say we expect the direct path to be at work if there is any sort of pathway at work. But if you read it as we're assuming away the indirect path, rather than just saying it's less likely, we need to temper our language a little bit. Because I don't think we want to do that.
And I think the queue is open. Babak? And then, let's go Risa first then, and then Babak.
So I think that maybe what we're talking about is the distinction that you sort of fold into the footnote about the targeted versus and smart sanctions stuff, which is, you know, a major part of the sanctions literature. And those of you who work primarily on sanctions know this better than I do. But, you know, essentially comprehensive trade sanctions, the logic is that you basically squeeze GDP, you squeeze the economy as a whole, and that can have certain distributional consequences, mostly on the people who are probably getting killed in genocide and maybe they're, you know, other normal people. And then you have the trade sanctions, on the targeted sanctions, which are elite centered, right? They freeze bank accounts overseas, or they prevent you from getting a visa to travel, or also prevent you from accessing international financial markets, things like that. And those, I would think, really might have an implications for stopping genocide, and that you'd get a more sort of traction with those kinds of sanctions. So I think that this is getting at sort of the puzzle, you know, the discussion of pathways of how sanctions should affect things. So I thought it was really interesting, and I didn't understand the sort of choice to not look at that mechanism as an alternative, which a lot of people do when they're comparing different types of sanctions, is this sort of targeted, elite-centered versus comprehensive trade and financial. So maybe you could say a little bit about how you came to that decision.
Okay, yeah, I mean, the reason that we chose not to distinguish the comprehensive and targeted was just that we didn't have very many instances of country years that have targeted sanctions in cases of genocide. So we would have loved to have done it, but we just couldn't.
Maybe say that in the paper and talk about the potential, you know, that you're testing this one type of sanctions, comprehensive trade, and that should, you know, you might expect that that wouldn't have an effect for A, B, and C reasons, but that, you know, we don't have the data to really assess the possibility that more elite-centered sanctions could matter and target the selectorate, those that actually go after the people with some power over policy. You know, I think somebody reading this is going to be caught off guard by seeing that in a footnote. So, so deal with it more centrally.
And if I could add, I also wouldn't describe it as a data limitation. I mean, these are strategic choices. Surely there's no discomfort. Theoretically thinking about the targeting states, the sanctioning states as strategic actors. So to me, that's quite interesting that that your data are so skewed. I'm sufficiently ignorant about the history of sanctions that maybe I shouldn't be so surprised, but that's, you know, that's not a random outcome in terms of what you're studying, and so I think I'm going to echo Risa and encourage you to say more about that, but when you do, to not just say, oh, the data didn't appear, observe that the data didn't appear, and that, you know, that might be something that sets up conclusions, you know, and policy implications, right? Perhaps part of the reason that we're not seeing them effective is that the types of sanctions being used are the ones where you would expect them to be less effective, you know, or something along those lines. It strikes me as, you know, you guys have a kind of brush clearing role you can play with this piece, and so just identifying that happens to be true, I think could be potentially interesting.
Okay, thanks.
Jackie on a 2?
So coming at this, we didn't do it because the data were limited, came from a different angle. I was wondering why genocide and politicide rather than a broader concept like mass killing or one-sided killing. I do think there are answers to that question. I think this is something that Matt does really well, for example, in his research on genocide and politicide, to say, here's why I focus on this phenomenon rather than what you might see as a broader class. But I do think it's something that needs to be addressed. And I don't think there's a wrong choice. I think you just really need to think about what outcome this theory can explain, and it might just be genocide and politicide, or it might be some broader set of phenomena that would then give you greater leverage in terms of that as well.
Okay, great. Babak.
Okay, I have two method comments. First, I have a question. For estimating your first stage equation, did you use these 42 cases?
I mean, the 42 cases are included, but it's...
Is it a global sample or a 42?
Yeah.
42?
No, sorry, it's the global sample, so it's something like 6,000 country years.
Okay, so then that's answer my first comment.
Yeah, I just didn't have the N in that table.
Yeah, it was that sort of because in that case I thought that it's suffering sample selection bias. The second one is in each period of time, I think you have a small number of genocide cases. That's one problem that probably you may have. I want to suggest that did you use the robust standard error calculation? And bootstrap actually, sorry, robust bootstrap, because the number of the cases in each year that you have is small. So I think using bootstrap a standard error calculation might be helpful to sort of address that problem.
Okay. Yeah, we haven't done that, but that's something you can do.
I'm going to jump in on a very geeky two-finger that I don't know if you want to just ignore this or actually address it, but since you're in the hypothesis testing world, and you don't set up a hypothesis that expects a relationship, and which defaults the null to no relationship, but you actually set up a hypothesis that says there isn't a relationship, which sets the null to there is. I mean, it actually gets a little unusual. But there is if you go digging around, there's a literature that the conventional alpha levels that we use, which of course are arbitrary anyway, but we do have conventions, they're actually not appropriate in that setting. And their power is low, and it's probably not going to make any difference to the actual inferences you draw, and almost nobody thinks about or pays attention to this because it's so unusual to hypothesize the absence of a relationship. But there is a literature. It's old and goes back, and I'm happy to send you some links to that if you want to.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see it.
I don't imagine there are many referees who are going to say anything. Matt?
Yeah, I've just been dinged on that recently too, on a similar thing, and so yeah, there are actually references. I'll go ahead and text one, assuming I know how to. There we go. Carlisle Rainey had a piece in American Journal of Political Science very recently, where it does a nice job of laying out why, if you are ultimately testing, if you're making the argument not that there's no statistically significant relationship, but rather that there's a negligible effect, that there's really no effect, which is I think what you're arguing, then the more traditional hypothesis testing with a p-value of less than 0.05, that might not go far enough to really demonstrate that there's no effect. It does a nice job of saying there's no evidence of an effect, but that's a little. It's more than just semantically different. And so I got dinged on that recently, and actually having gone back and looked through that, it's it's very helpful to think about it that way, and it's statistically relatively easy to do. He talks about doing a 90% confidence interval as a way to get around that. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that article, and that's building off of this older statistical literature that Will was talking about.
Okay, thanks.
Jackie.
So while we're geeking out on standard errors and good reasons to bootstrap them, in your generalized ordered logit, did you calculate the inverse Mills ratio by hand and then insert that into that equation?
No, I just used the go logit2 command.
Okay, so I'm not super familiar with that command, but what I do know is that in most cases, using that first stage selection effect and then putting that regressor, that inverse Mills ratio, into the outcome will artificially inflate your standard errors.
Okay.
And so there's a process by which you can deflate them, and the quick and dirty way to do that is to bootstrap. So that's another good way to bootstrap your standard error, or a good reason to bootstrap them. It does run the risk of having significance pop up. I don't know if that would be the worst thing in your world. But certainly it's going to get you closer to true effects.
Okay.
Okay, I think we have an open queue, so a couple of pieces, and I'm actually going to do a shameless self-promotion here that may be relevant, or may be interesting for you to look at. Matt hinted at one of them. A specific paper I will encourage you to look at is from Lebovich and Voten, where they're looking at the impact of UN sanctions on human rights violations. And I don't mean UN sanctions. United Nations High Commission on Refugees shaming, not actual sanctions. They may actually, now that I'm thinking about it, they may actually look at sanctions in that paper as well. I can't recall. And, that connects with Jackie's point about the, potentially broader. But I think that's it's a paper worth looking at for thinking about additional specifications, particularly if you, and then the other one is a paper by Courtney Conrad and myself on what stops torture, right? So we do a similar thing where we think about, instead of genocide, we're thinking about torture as spells, and we're saying, well, once you get onset, what would lead it to end? And we break down, we don't go with a polity, or similar measure of democracy, but actually distinguish between different types of democratic institutions and make an argument that powerful courts play a big role. And I don't know that you want to go there, but you could. You could connect this other literature and see whether it wouldn't surprise me if you would run into all sorts of variation problems, such that, for example, it wouldn't surprise me at all if the states that have genocide events all have very weak domestic court systems, right? Or don't have many veto players, some of the things that Courtney and I look at. So, in other words, once you get the onset, your variation in some of the variables that might make a difference theoretically may be just so constrained, right? Because it's a selection process, and if that's the case, then that might strengthen why you would really need to see targeted sanctions. That of a very particular type. That's pushing you theoretically in a whole different direction, raising all sorts of things that you're not yet talking about, and I don't know that that's where you want to go with the paper, but it has potential links back to some of the earlier points that Risa was making in terms of, and some of the others in terms of thinking theoretically differently, and crafting a paper. If you look at Courtney and my paper, it's unusual in a couple of different respects. We end up establishing the absence of variance in our dependent variable once you select on a certain number of independent variables, right? And that's not a normal type of evidence that political scientists typically report. But I think you have some potential to maybe find some of those things. And if you do, then to make, there's the potential. I don't know that it's actually would be supported in your data, but there's the potential to find that that the types of sanctions that get leveled would really, we theoretically wouldn't expect them to have much of an effect because of the characteristics of the regime type and the type of support that the states that engage in these practices have. So that's kind of long and rambling, but I'll get you the citations.
Okay.
Jackie on it too, and did someone else that I missed while I was yakking? No. Okay, Jackie.
Well, Matt didn't say it, so I will. If you dig into the Leibovitz and Voten, and so you're looking at the effects of shaming on repression, Matt has a 2012 ISQ piece looking at naming and shaming's effects on genocide and politicide.
Okay.
Specifically, right? Is it specifically? There you go. Okay. Matt's got something.
I'm multitasking. Matt? Yeah.
Yeah, and while we're engaging in mutual citation, Jackie's got a similar piece right around the same time, looking at naming and shaming on, I believe you call it mass killings, but
one-sided killings.
One-sided killings, but it encompasses a lot of the same events, and although it's technically a different phenomena, the process that she lays out, in particular the principal agent model, I think, is potentially theoretically useful tool too if you're going to dig into thinking about how the target regime may be affected by sanctions, and as Will was talking about, this issue with the selectorate. So that might be a very useful piece to look at as well. Even if you're not going to be linking directly with or looking directly at naming and shaming, the process might be very helpful there.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. We have an open queue. I'm just going to go left to right. Babak, is there anything that you haven't had a chance to?
I have, if I may, I want to. I have a question about coding this, sequence again. I think it was interesting because again I refer to Iran case because I'm only familiar with that case. There was a genocide. It seems there was a genocide in 1988. But Iran has been experiencing economic sanction from U.S. and some European countries since 1980. So the way that you coded this sanction, I think if a country like Iran experiencing economic sanction, then it would be different for you than this sanction is just for some other issues that that the state is involved, or it's directly related to this violation of human rights or genocide problem that they are experiencing. So this is my point actually.
Yeah, so I mean, the one thing that we were able to do was, if the episode of sanctions started before the episode of genocide, we didn't include it. We've thought a lot about this question of what if the sanctions are not actually imposed with respect to the genocide at all? They just happen to sort of co-occur, and that's something that we're not 100% sure how to deal with. I think there's reason to believe that we wouldn't expect to hear the word genocide used every time that the sanctions are imposed, because genocide seems to be a term that's very political, and certain obligations might come with it. Whether or not those obligations actually do come with it, but it's maybe an open question. But then there's another concern that policymakers might use a slightly different definition of genocide than the one that we're using, maybe not include politicides. But yeah, we're considering running all the same models that we have here with just a more conservative coding of sanction, where we'll go back through and sort of read the all of the press associated with the sanction and see if it mentions violence or some other thing that we can more directly connect to genocide. It's not something we've done yet, but hopefully we'll be able to answer your question pretty soon.
Good.
Matt?
On that topic, it's too bad Christian's not here because he's actually the person I'm going to refer to, but I'm pretty sure Christian Davenport and Ben Appel have done some similar work looking at onset of sanctions, but also severity of sanctions. Onset and severity of spells of serious human rights violations, including genocide. And if I remember correctly, their decision rule for including sanctions was whether or not it addressed the sanctions were specifically addressing either human rights issues or regime change issues. It might be worth contacting him to figure out exactly what decision rule they used, but that was a way that and that's usually embedded in the data set itself. I think TIES has the issues about which the sanctions, and so that's a way of, on the one hand, as you said, most leaders aren't going to say this is explicitly because of genocide or because that ties them into some international legal entanglements, but they're probably going to use the language of human rights, given what we know about the language of human rights and sanctions and shaming and whatnot. So there may be a way around that where you can more narrowly focus on particular kinds of sanctions that we might expect might signal that certain changes of behavior are expected.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. We need to shame Christian for not showing up. So, although I did send a link to that paper. I don't think it's published, but again, he would have brought it up. I know he would have talked about it. I think we're open. Halvard, did you have anything you haven't had a chance to?
Okay, so this is something entirely different, and again, this is a comment that is colored by my lack of knowledge with this specific literature. But I found Figure 1 quite interesting, which shows the trend over time in genocide occurrence. And maybe this is well explained in the literature, although I didn't see much reference to that in the paper, so I'm asking anyway. First of all, I think it would be nice to know a little bit more about temporal trends in various forms of sanctions, to what extent they correspond or not with a distinct inverse U-curve that we see in the distribution of genocide. And then relatedly, the steep decline in genocide in the 90s and not an increase since then. Well, of course, we have Syria today, but the decline in genocide seems to be much stronger than the contemporaneous decline in conflict. So what would be explaining that decline if it isn't sanctions? Is it just the standard explanations of the decline in conflict related to peacekeeping missions, general international activism, clearly end of Cold War financing, and the liberal peace, or are there other explanations for this pretty strong decline in genocide?
Yeah, that's something I haven't thought a lot about, but I do see why it would be useful to talk about that in the paper. Sorry if I give you a better answer.
I mean, of course, that could be a different paper in itself, so I'm not so much saying that you should incorporate an elaborate discussion in this paper. This was more just based on my curiosity, what would be driving that decline, and it could perhaps be worthwhile reflecting on that in one or two sentences, because in the paper, as it stands, the figure is referred to, and then the decline is described in a very general term, but there is no engagement. So one or two sentences here, and then I was basically just wondering whether there is other research elsewhere that actually explains that steep decline.
There's not that I know of, but that's not to say that there isn't literature out there on this.
I think, Whitney, that was an opportunity to punt to your co-author. I think. It's like, where's Hollie? Okay. Jackie, did you have anything else that you wanted to You're muted, Jackie.
Good thing I said nothing of value yet. Thank you. I think most of what I had to say has been touched on. One thing that I would add while I am sort of adding to your reading list is that Nikolai Marinov has a 2005 AJPS paper that I think explains your findings really nicely and might be helpful as you're developing this. He shows that sanctions destabilize leaders in the target state, that sanctions actually make leaders more likely to lose office. And so if you tease that out, the implication for you is that leaders whose grasp on power is threatened are really likely to act to consolidate power. And one really quick and dirty and effective way to consolidate power is to continue or ramp up acts of repression and human rights abuse, including genocide. So if that's helpful, I just wanted to toss it.
Yeah, thanks.
I think that's all I had that we haven't touched on.
Great. Matt?
Yet. There we go. Okay. Yeah, we've touched on most of the important things that I had down. I had a couple of really minor methodological notes that I just thought I'd throw out there. I think one of the real contributions here is that other folks have looked at onset and severity, and that you're really pushing. One of the things this paper does is really push to try to think about duration. I really liked your answer earlier about how those two things may, you can reduce severity and duration is still really important, right? So I really like that. When you start thinking about, in the paper, talking about the variables you want to control for as you think about what's going to affect duration, I would push you to think more theoretically about the phenomena that you're interested in and less about borrowing from the Civil War literature, because part of what you're doing is saying genocides and politicides are distinct phenomena, and therefore we need to understand them. To then go and say, oh, and we're going to borrow the control variables from the duration of Civil War literature, I think methodologically is problematic, but more importantly, it undercuts your argument, I think, for why this paper is necessary. So I would encourage you to maybe look at the few pieces that do look at duration, but also think theoretically about why might we expect that sanctions might reduce or increase, as I think you just argued, duration. And I think you'll probably come up with a very similar set of control variables, but for better reasons that are internally consistent with your argument. And then the other thing is that you do control for direction of intervention, but there's enough contention among the folks who argue that that's important as to what direction. Some of those folks are here, some of those folks aren't here. If Reed Wood were here, he'd be saying, Matt's wrong, Jackie's wrong, and he and Jake Kathman may be right, but the direction of intervention may matter, right? You sort of hint at that in the paper and talk about neutral peacekeepers potentially being very different than an intervention against someone engaging in atrocity, or as we're seeing in Syria, an intervention for actors engaging in atrocity. So it might be worth thinking about that. I'm certainly okay if you just want to control for the fact that there is intervention, but whether it supports or does not support, the regime may matter for what you're arguing.
Okay.
Great. Risa?
I don't have much more to say right now, but I do want to echo this sort of contribution of thinking about magnitude and duration as a different way of thinking about success and sort of bridging to this sort of larger part of that literature that's thinking about, how should we think about the efficacy of sanctions? And you have something really interesting to say about that matters in a really practical sense, because we do care how many people are killed, but also matters for how we conceptualize, success in this literature. So I echo that. I think that's really important. And the thing that I was going to say is, I might have missed this, but I think it's worth considering more what the selection effect, or saying more about it, because obviously you know what the effect is, of only looking at genocide once the violence has started, because it just seems like there's so many sort of domestic political things that could come into play once people have started killing people that makes it a lot harder to pull back than if you get it when they're organizing state violence before the onset of it. And, obviously a threat of sanctions imposition at that point we would expect might actually work. I don't know empirically if there's a case of that, but just that seems like a really important decision and an inevitable decision that you make there, looking after violence started. But maybe saying more about that, I guess.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. Whitney, you've got a group of us here who've read your paper. You don't often get chances to throw questions to such a group. But do you have any that you'd like to poll us, or throw out problems that you're trying to address that we haven't touched on?
Yeah, a couple that I think we've referenced in the. Let me figure out what in section 5. It's called probing results. Somewhere around like 21, 22. There are a couple of questions I've gotten when I've presented this before about sort of. Wouldn't we expect sanctions to be imposed when magnitude is higher, or wouldn't we expect genocide to get worse before it gets better? And so we tried to sort of address these possible questions or critiques by sort of essentially cross-tabbing magnitude and these other things. So like. Magnitude and the year that the sanction was imposed. But did you guys find that compelling? Did you have these questions before you got to this section? Is that question clear?
Yep.
Okay.
I did not have that question, and did I find it compelling?
Or I guess on the other hand, did it make it, if you didn't have that question, did addressing it in this way actually make you consider it and think, I guess that you were less convinced?
I mean, potentially. So I think my reaction was that, that could be a problem. And here's some evidence. To be honest, I gave a little bit of thought and emphasis on a little. How would I do that better? And decided that was kind of a hard question, and just decided that I was like, I don't know. And so I effectively let it go. I think that's the honest response that I had. Let me see what how did others of you react? Oh, sorry, I muted myself. Go ahead, Matt, and then just go ahead, just jump in.
Yeah. I wouldn't say didn't pay attention as much to that, because I did, but it didn't bring up any new questions. I was actually more concerned about making sure that you had addressed the how long the sanctions had been in place, and you did that, which for me theoretically was potentially more problematic. But I think it's an interesting question about when during the life of an atrocity does the international community intervene, and does that really make a difference? It almost seemed like yet another. You have the potential to spin off a number of different projects and questions here, and I think that's an important question that I think you at least take a stab at here, and it didn't raise any red flags for me. But might be something to think about in the future, really elaborating on, because it is an important question. It may very well matter when one intervenes, in terms of the magnitude of the atrocity, but also in terms of the timeline. As many are fond of pointing out, at a certain point, regimes run out of people to kill, at which point it may look like it may look like sanctions are effective when in fact it's just the regime is winding down its atrocities, and when you engage in those sanctions is going to make a difference, especially given the point that a few of us have made, and that you made, that sanctions take a while to take effect, right, and to even go through the process of being implemented. So, but that part didn't necessarily raise that for me. I think I sort of was thinking about that earlier when you were talking about the theoretical argument and the model specification.
Halvard?
Yeah, I also did not react specifically to the question or the point that you raised. I guess at that point in reading the paper, I was primarily concerned with, are you really capturing that change in behavior that you theorize, and what would be the appropriate time span to focus on, and whether the yearly or the country year design really is appropriate here, or whether you would want to implement some kind of lag structure to your explanatory variables, to your sanction variables. So I guess, and that is a little bit related, but at the same time, and I guess this has been discussed earlier today, I guess that was my main concern when it comes to how to set up the actual analysis here.
Mm-hmm.
Did the others of you have any reaction or comment to that? No? Okay. Any other things you want to toss out to us, Whitney?
No, I mean, I think those are you obviously touched on most of the main weaknesses we had sort of anticipated in the paper, and that was sort of my only remaining question at this moment.
Babak, did I see a one finger there? Okay.
Okay, I want to follow up Matt's point about the duration of sanction and duration of genocide. I think I like different ways that you actually operationalize sanction. But I think about sanction age, you might think about that in short term, sanction cannot have a significant effect because it's new. And in the long term, we say, okay, if you wanted to have an effect, so it would have before. It could have before. So at the middle is the time that you expect the highest level of success for economic sanctions. So it's not a monotone relationship between these two. So I thought maybe you want to estimate the sanction age and it's a square to maybe actually model this non-linear relationship between these two factors.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think you're right about the short term versus long term versus middle term. So yeah.
Okay, great. Well, let me thank everybody for taking the time out, especially our discussants who work for free and get no glory or other benefit. When Christian and I started this initiative, we weren't sure whether people would be willing to volunteer their time in this way. So without you guys, it doesn't happen. So we like to make sure we close by thanking everybody. And Whitney, also thank you for submitting the paper and giving us such an interesting project to talk about.
Yeah, thanks for this opportunity. And I also want to thank all of you for taking the time to read this and give me such good feedback.
All right, great.
Right.
Enjoy the rest of your day, folks.
Bye.
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 Bye.